Now welcome back to Gabriel Prod. Today we are going to see how to create a stylized fire with Unity VFX Graph and Shader Graph, and a very few simple techniques. And I think it turned out pretty sweet. Just look at this, it's actually very mesmerizing and quite customizable too. As you can see, with only one VFX Graph, you can create several variations of a fire. Pretty cool. All of this is possible thanks to my patrons, and by supporting me you get access to this project and many other assets that you can use in your games and in your projects. Links in the description. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. And I'm using Unity 2020.3.14 with the Universal Render Pipeline. And in the package manager I have also installed VFX Graph and Shader Graph. By the way, just make sure that in Edit, in Preference, you go to Visual Effects and you turn on Experimental Operators / Blocks. Alright, so this is the stylized effect I have here. Thanks to VFX Graph I have quite a few properties that I can play with and adjust the fire, but the coolest one is the possibility to change the texture on the fly, and the fire will look completely different, as you can see. Even with the default part it looks kinda interesting, which is nice. So let's see how we can create something similar to this. The first thing we want to do is create an empty game object. We can rename it to VFX_fire, for example, and reset the transform so it goes to the origin of the world. In my case it's useful. And inside a folder, with right click we can go to create and create a visual effect graph. We can also rename it to VFX Graph_fire. And then we want to parent this to the empty we just created. Drag and drop it, make sure it's parented and that the position is 0, 0, 0. Now we can press the edit button to open VFX Graph, and I'm simply going to duck this around here and make some room. Okay, so down here we have the target game object, quite useful to slow down the effect. And then we have the black board where we can add properties. And on this area, if you don't see anything, you can press F and it will automatically focus on the particle system, as you can see. What you may also be noticing is that I don't think this default particle can be useful to create a fire. So yeah, we need to create a new texture. The texture is what will give a different aesthetic to the stylized effect. We are going to create something very simple, by the way. In this case I'm going to use Photoshop and I'm going to create a new file, rename it to Flame03 with 2048 by 2048 pixels. And then with the bucket tool I'm going to paint the background to black and create a new layer with Ctrl+Shift+N. Now the idea is super simple. We want to use the pen tool, make sure it's set to path, and you don't need to copy exactly the flame I'm going to create. You can create your own style, try different things. I'm sure it will look interesting in the end, the fire, and you can always create a new texture. Basically, once you have a shape that you enjoy, make sure you close the path, by the way. With right click, we want to go ahead and fill this with a color, in this case a white color. And I'm going to add 50 pixels to the feather radius, so it fades out in the edges, and then press OK. And with right click we can delete this path. And here we go, we got something to start with. Now the idea is to pick the erase tool at 50% of opacity and hardness at 30% more or less. And with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, more or less 6 strokes, we want to remove a little bit of the white. We want to create some gray areas, as you can see. It's nothing special, guys. You can give it a twist or give a final adjustments with the smudge tool if you want, by the way. As you can see, it's quite useful. But once you have a text that you enjoy, what we can do is simply save this Photoshop file directly to Unity. Or you can export it as a PNG. And here it is in the text folder, the Flame03. Now we could assign it directly to the VFX Graph, but we need some properties. The first one is a color. It's going to be quite useful. And I'm going to pick an orange more or less around here with these values and with an intensity of around 5. We are going to change it later, so no big deal. And then we can add a texture 2D, so we can use the flame we just created I'm gonna rename it to flame texture and assign the flame 03 in my case, and then we can connect it down here to the main texture of the output particle quad. By the way guys, if you want to learn more about VFX Graph, I made a course recently that can be quite useful. This one. As you can see, we are going to create something awesome and you will learn a lot about VFX Graph. I left some links in the description. Our flame has the black background, but we don't need to go back to Photoshop to remove it, because we are going to need a shader. It's going to be a useful shader to dissolve these flames and animate them. So with right click, we can create a VFX shader graph or a blank shader graph. I'm going to start with a blank shader graph, rename it to Fire Shader, and double click it to open it up. And now in the targets, in the graph inspector, I'm going to add visual effect so we can use it in the VFX graph. It can be unlit, that's fine. And in here, we are basically going to do the same thing that we have around here. We are going to replicate the main texture, but first we need a color. With the color property selected in the graph inspector, we can set the mode to HDR and select a white color. And now we can add a texture 2D and call it main texture. And it's a very simple shader, guys. All we gotta do is drag and drop this to around here. And for example, for the main texture, we simply need to sample it, drag a line, search for sample texture 2D, and then multiply it with the color. And connect it to the base color of the fragment. And that's it. We can save this asset, and if we go back to our VFX graph, in the output particle quad we have a shader graph input, and then we can select the fire shader we just created. If you don't see this shader graph input, you can go to Edit, Preference, and in Visual Effects you can turn on Experimental Operators / Blocks. Okay, so as you can see, we have some weird names that we are going to take care in a moment. Those are the properties we created, by the way. For now, we can simply connect the color, and here we go. Orange it is, indeed, and quite bright. But we still have the black background. And we can easily remove it by going back to the shader, and in this case, we can connect the main texture directly to the alpha. If we save this asset, we no longer have the black background. And that's a start, that's a great start. From here now, we can already create the dissolve effect in shader graph and actually take care of these names. The reference is what will appear in VFX Graph. And what I like to do is copy the name of the property and paste it to the reference and simply add an underscore in front. That's more than enough. Let's assign the flame we just created to the main texture so we can see what we are doing. I'm gonna push this a little bit back, and the way we create a dissolve is super simple. We are going to multiply something with this main texture. And that something, we have 3 procedurally generated noises in shader graph. I'm going to use the Voronoi in this case, it looks good with a fire. Now we just need a power node. If we multiply this power node with the main texture and replace the connections to the color and to the alpha as well. If we save this and go back to VFX Graph, if we play the flames, as you can see, they are already being dissolved. It's that simple. We need to make a few adjustments, but for now, let's take care of the motion of this fire. So for example, up here in the set velocity, the X and Z it's going to be -0.1 and 0.1. We are going to leave the Y at 0.2 and 1 for now. One thing that is annoying me is the rotation. They all have the same rotation. So with a set angle, with the channel set to Z, I'm gonna make it random in the inspector, as you can see, between 360 and -360, and we get randomness a lot. They leave for way too much, so 0.8 and 1.6 for the lifetime, for now. And then we want to control the size, of course. So down here in the output particle quad, with a set size, we can set it to random, uniform, between 0.6 and 2. But nothing changes because the set size of our life is overwriting any previous value of the size. So in the composition we can set it to multiply. Okay, so this curve right here, it goes from small to big, but we actually want this to go from big to small. We can start with this curve right here, push the last key above the 0.5, And then with the handles, make it a little bit curvy. We are starting to see something interesting. By the way, let's also remove the set color of a life. We are going to fade in and fade out with the dissolve option. Which actually, we need to create a property for that, for this power node. So let's create a float and call it dissolve power. Copy and paste the name to the reference and add an underscore. Default value of 1 and connect to the power. Let's create another one, another float for the dissolve scale. Default value of 6. Connect to the cell density. And now we can animate this angle offset. We just need to create a float, call it dissolve speed, and multiply this with a time variable. And then connect to the angle offset. If we increase the dissolve speed, as you can see, it's moving around. Cool. Let's select all of these and create a group, call it dissolve. Save these assets. And now basically what we want to do is animate this dissolve power. As you can see, it will dissolve away the flames. So we do it by sampling a curve. We want to animate this through a curve. We can start with this line that starts from 0. Push the handle like this and drag it to the right, more or less to 0.3. And for the last key, with right click we want to edit the key and say the value is 30. Okay, so let's see, let's push it a little bit to the front actually. And connect it to dissolve power. Nothing will happen because, as you can see, it's not dissolving. We need to animate this time. It goes from 0 to 1. And there's a property that each particle has that goes from 0 to 1, which is the age over lifetime. If we connect it to time, now it will animate, and now we can make a few more precise adjustments to this curve. We want this to start with a little bit of dissolve, and then it dissolves away just like this. So I'm gonna push this a little bit up so it isn't intersecting with the ground. Wonderful. That's looking very nice. And it's pretty much done. We can select everything, create a group, and name it flames. So now if you want, you can add properties to control them in the inspector, so you can create variations. Properties like flame rate float, a flame velocity vector tree, a flame's lifetime float, and flame size float. This will give you a lot of control over this fire effect. We can also create the smoke. Let's copy this group, Ctrl C, and paste it with Ctrl V and rename it to smoke. Okay, so first thing, we don't need color. It's going to be black straight away. We don't need this flame size because it's going to be bigger, between 3 and 1.2. And the lifetime a little bit more, like 2.6 and 1.2. Now as you can see, the flames kinda lost their brightness. That's because the smoke is being rendered in front of the flames. If you go to the folder where you have the VFX Graph Fire, if you select it, we have this output render order, but the output particle quads don't have a name. We can rename it, for example, this one to smoke and the other one to flames. Now if you select again the VFX Graph _ Fire, you can see their names and we can push the smoke to be the first one being rendered, leaving the flames to be rendered in front of the smoke. As you can see now they are bright once again. Good. Now once again, if you want, you can create the same properties that we have created for the flames, but this time for the smoke. Like a smoke rate, smoke lifetime, a smoke size, and a smoke velocity, among other properties that you wish to control. I'm gonna fast forward this part because it takes some time and it's up to you to decide which properties you would like to control. And by the way, just don't forget to increase the capacity to something like 1000, for example, of the smoke and of the flames too. So, as you can see, we have the flames and we have the smoke nicely dissolving away. Very cool actually. Now let's add one of the final touches, which are some simple ambers flying around. So let's copy the flames particle system, rename it to ambers, And well, the first thing is the texture. We don't want this texture, we want the default texture that comes in all of Unity projects, default particle. It's more than enough. We also don't want flame size, we want this to be small, like 0.05 and 0.2. Lifetime is different, they will live longer, between 1.6 and 3.2. And we are starting to see something, as you can see. Flames velocity, we don't want them. If you want, you can create properties for this later. The only thing I'm going to increase is the Y, 1.6 and 0.4. And as you can see now, they look weird. To me, they look weird. And that's because of the dissolve scale. It is too big. If you decrease it to 1 or 2, it will look very interesting as well. Now the last step is to increase the spawn, if you want, to 30. Okay, cool. Alright, so for the final touch, we want some light. But VFX Graph cannot control lights for now. So a very simple way to control lights is to create a particle system. Call it light. And in this case, we don't want start speed. And in the emission, we don't want rate over time, we want a burst of one particle. And we don't want shape, we want it to be in the same position, always. Down here we want to turn on lights, and it's very simple. We want to go to our scene, we right click, go to lights and create a point light. Create a prefab, simply drag and drop to a folder. Delete the one in the scene, go back to the light particle system and drag and drop the prefab light we just created, like this, and set the ratio to 1. Here we go, we have light, it's white, it's very basic. Let's change the intensity to 10 and the range to 5 or 10. And as you can see, we still have a particle here. If you don't want this particle, in the render, you can set the render mode to none. And you will only have the light, nothing else, which is super cool. And for the color now, you can choose a similar one. Yeah, orange. If you want to make it blink, you can also do it here, that's the cool thing. Simply turn on color of a lifetime, add a bunch of keys up here, and decrease some of them. So it looks like it's breathing, basically. It will add a nice touch. And that's a nice way to control lights. And yeah, that's pretty much it. One of the last things we can do is, I'm gonna give you a nice color, which is 6 for the hue, 95 for the saturation, and 75 for the value. It's a really cool color for a fire. You can also increase the intensity to 6.5. I also have some post-processing effects, a global volume by the way. Really cool. And if you want, you can create properties for the ambers, so you can control them in Inspector. And it's useful to create properties because now, for example, you can drag and drop this VFX Fire, create a prefab, and then with right click, duplicate it. And now you can make a bunch of changes to this new prefab and create a totally different fire with a different texture if you want. That's all you gotta do, you create it one time and you can create quite a few fire variations, like a purple one for example. Look how cool it is. I have done quite a few, I have played with this and it's a pretty cool exercise. I hope you have enjoyed. All of this is available on my Patreon page and many other projects in case you want to support me. That would be awesome and very much appreciated. I have links below and it's so well appreciated that I want to say a big thank you to each patron. All of you matter a lot to me, and as usual a special shout out to the top tier patrons, which are Al, Elak Frost, Alex Berg-Jones, Eric Oftikian, Bradford Arendt, David Crew, David Maid Lars, Diana Simonian, Donald Thompson, Electric Brain, Edward Chai, Game Go-Go Joe, Goblin Plague, Hostile Mars Game, Jeremy Martin, Josh McCormick, Jules Klein, Lianos, Maxim, Madhav Gupta, Mikhail Tello, Mograph Tech, Nat Sims, Oitsk, OV Sands, Radioactive Bullfrog, Revenant Games, Ricard Cruz, Tyler Fritz, Unknown Enigma, Very Suta, Willie Closen, YY, Zarbat Bredding, and Ingu Das. Thank you so much for your support, you keep the channel alive so I can keep on making these videos. To everyone watching this video, I hope you have enjoyed, so thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks, bye.